Hello, and welcome to another virtual panel discussion of the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for joining today's session on conflict-related sexual violence and the responsibility to protect. Since time immemorial, sexual violence has been a prevalent and tragic feature of war and human conflict. In recent years, increased attention has turned to understanding its causes and its effects. A critically important finding from social science has been that sexual violence is not inevitable, and that patterns of variation are observable within and between conflicts. Alongside this proliferation of scholarship which deepens our knowledge of how and why conflict-related sexual violence happens, efforts to combat conflict-related sexual violence on the ground have gained traction with global policymaking. And as the global political commitment to prevent mass atrocity crimes, including sexual violence as it manifests as a mass atrocity, the responsibility to protect is an important tool. So, as conflict-related sexual violence continues to extract a terrible toll in many parts of the world, including the Central African Republic, China, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Libya, Myanmar, Syria, and Yemen, to name but a few. How and where have international responses fallen short? And what specific tools does the responsibility to protect afford policymakers and practitioners, both in prevention and in response? These are some of the questions that we will be asking today. I am Thomas Peake, Research Associate at the Centre for Geopolitics. Now, I'm joined today by Elizabeth Jean Wood, Crosby Professor of the Human Environment and Professor of Political Science, International and Area Studies at Yale University, Christine Chinkin, Emerita Professor of International Law, Professorial Research Fellow, and Founding Director of the Centre of Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics, and Kate Cronin-Furman, Lecturer in Political Science and Director of the Human Rights MA at University College London. Welcome. And welcome also to our truly global audience. I encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Simply type your question in the box and it will be directed to our guests. And please do note whether or not your question is directed to a specific panelist or whether it is addressed to the panel in general, and please do add your name and university or other affiliation if you have one. And now, before we get to the questions from the audience, I will invite each of our speakers to say a few words, beginning with Elizabeth Wood.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. Beginning in June 2014, forces of the Islamic State swept through northern Iraq, capturing the city of Mosul. In August, they attacked the Yazidi people, besieging towns, executing thousands, and forcing entire families to flee up the slopes of Mount Sinjar. Approximately 3,000 girls and women were kidnapped. Most were sexually enslaved. It is not just non-state actors that engage in sexual violence during conflict. After the suppression of the Arab Spring protests and the emergence of armed rebellion in 2012, Syrian government forces sexually tortured both male and female political detainees, according to testimonies of victims, witnesses, and defecting soldiers. Nor is it just authoritarian regimes who sexually abuse civilians during conflict. During the war in Vietnam, US soldiers in some units raped civilians, including during the infamous massacre of 500 at My Lai. However, some armed organizations effectively prohibit rape. Rebel forces in El Salvador's civil war very rarely raped, even as state forces engaged in frequent rape during massacres and of massive sexual torture of detainees. The Tamil Tigers forced Muslims from northern Syria with little sexual violence. Rape and other forms of sexual violence during war inflict profound pain on survivors and those that did not survive, their families, and their communities. 2 decades of research has shown that these crimes are not unavoidable collateral damage, they are not inevitable, and they can be avoided. To do so depends on understanding why and how sexual violence during war occurs. So what do we know about conflict-related sexual violence? I offer here a quick summary of recent research by the growing community of scholars working on the topic. I already mentioned the most important finding, the extraordinary differences in the frequency of sexual violence by armed organizations, in particular, the difference in the incidence of rape from massive to very rare. Armed organizations, be they state or non-state forces, differ not only in the frequency of sexual violence, but in its form, including rape during operations, sexual slavery, forced marriage, sexual torture, forced abortion, among others. They also differ in its targeting. Some organizations victimize only particular social groups, those groups sometimes defined by their ethnic or religious identity, or sometimes by their political activism, trade unionists, for example. While the Islamic State sexually enslaved Yazidi girls and women, it did not enslave Sunni Muslims, but did subject some to child or forced marriage. Some groups, including the Bosnian Serbs, target boys and men, as well as girls and women. Some target gender and sexual minorities. Common arguments about violence during war do not adequately explain these differences. Wartime opportunity, territorial control, ethnic hatred, and lootable resources that disrupt discipline all contribute to the incidence of rape by some organizations, but there are also characteristics of other organizations that do not engage in frequent wartime sexual violence. Nor is wartime sexual violence simply a reflection or perhaps an amplification of patterns of sexual violence during peacetime. Rather, wartime sexual violence may differ sharply from peacetime patterns towards much higher frequency and more brutal forms, particularly gang rape, and perhaps with wider targeting, or in some settings towards less sexual violence by some organizations. It is often assumed that when members of an armed organization do rape frequently, it is therefore a strategy of war. To be sure, some armed actors do adopt sexual violence as a military strategy. For example, in some cases of ethnic cleansing, genocide, or sexual torture. But organizations may adopt some form of sexual violence as policy, but for other reasons other than military strategy, often to manage the sexual and reproductive lives of its members, as in the case of the so-called comfort women held by the Japanese military during World War II. But the assumption that if rape or some other form of sexual violence is frequent, it is therefore a strategy or policy is a misconception. It may be frequent without having been adopted as a policy. Rather, as in the case of US forces at My Lai, commanders may tolerate its occurrence without adopting it as policy. In these cases, rape is a practice rather than a strategy or policy of war. Combatants act opportunistically or because gendered social dynamics drive them to participate. In many such organizations, combatants were forcibly and randomly recruited and are then coerced by other combatants to engage in gang rape of civilians, which creates social bonds among the unit. Whether social violence occurs as a policy or a practice, ideology plays an essential role. In particular, gendered norms, beliefs, and hierarchies are critical to an organization's form, targeting, and frequency of sexual violence. Those norms may license sexual abuse of certain social groups, reinforce masculine entitlement over girls and women's, justify the targeting of gender and sexual minorities. The gendered norms, beliefs, and hierarchies on the part of combatants may reflect those of peacetime society if those combatants were little changed by their participation in the armed organization, or They may reflect the socialization of recruits into new gendered norms, beliefs, and hierarchies. Those new concepts may stem from social dynamics among combatants, or they may reflect the organization's indoctrination of members into its ideology. Note that commanders' gendered norms and beliefs may differ from those of combatants and are critical to whether the commanders promote, punish, or tolerate sexual violence. However, an organization's ideology and consequent gendered norms may, in some cases, mandate the effective prohibition of rape and other forms of sexual violence. Such organizations build strong institutions of socialization to inculcate norms of restraint and of discipline to ensure punishment for their breach. There is, on the other hand, a lot we still do not understand about conflict-related sexual violence. While it is clear that ideology is an important determinant of the patterns of sexual violence, we do not understand well why armed organizations hold particular ideologies. Nor do we understand the conditions under which organizations embrace their ideology as foundational as opposed to mere window dressing. Many, for example, claim to prohibit any form of sexual violence, gesturing towards their ideology and code of conduct, yet commanders do nothing when that code is violated. Relatedly, the socialization of commanders merits more scholarly and policy attention, as their promotion, toleration, or effective prohibition of sexual violence is critical. And we're only beginning to grapple with the challenges of reversing entrenched patterns of sexual violence, particularly when it is a frequent practice, as is clear in the pattern of ongoing sexual assault within the ranks of the US military. These findings, that patterns of sexual violence differ in form, targeting, and frequency across armed organizations, that rape is, once again, not inevitable, that sexual violence may be adopted as a policy for non-strategic reasons, and that it may be frequent, even if not a policy, if it is tolerated by commanders. These findings matter for efforts to prevent or at least mitigate sexual violence during conflict and to hold organizations accountable for sexual violence afterward. In these difficult and violent times, I and my social science colleagues hope that our work offers insight for advocates, for activists, practitioners, prosecutors, judges, and others working to end rape, sexual torture, sexual slavery, and all types of violence against civilians during war. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to Christine Chinkin, please, Professor Chinkin.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for the invitation to be here tonight, which is a real pleasure. We've just had a very full, for 10 minutes, account of the social science research into some of the causes, perpetrators of conflict-affected sexual violence. I'm going to turn rather more directly to the responsibility to protect doctrine and to look at it very briefly alongside the Security Council agenda on women, peace and security. I think the important point about the responsibility to protect is that it clearly reiterates basic obligations for individual states under international law. So in particular, it sets out that there is the obligation on states to protect those within their jurisdiction from atrocities, such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, to prevent violence and violations of those international crimes, and to comply with their human rights obligations. The role of the international community under the responsibility to protect is to assist those individual states to comply with those obligations under international law. And it accepts that military intervention is a last resort that should only be engaged when that primary responsibility has not been fulfilled. And any intervention must take place within the framework of the collective security provisions of the United Nations Charter. Now, conflict-affected sexual violence is not directly included in the language of the responsibility to protect, but it is, of course, recognized as included within international criminal law definitions of those various categories of crime, crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc. But where conflict-affected sexual violence is indeed central is in the Security Council Women, Peace and Security agenda, the agenda that started with Resolution 1325 back in the year 2000 and has since been developed in a further 9 Security Council resolutions. What Women, Peace and Security attempts to do is to bring women's experiences of conflict into decision and policy making, to prevent sexual violence and armed conflict, and indeed conflict itself, to protect against sexual violence and armed conflict, end impunity and enhance accountability, as well as having provisions relating to relief and recovery for survivors. So the emphasis throughout the Women, Peace and Security resolutions is on securing accountability through criminal justice mechanisms. So the idea of individual criminal liability for the commission of international crimes, either directly by the perpetrators or through command responsibility, something that has been implicitly touched upon a moment ago by Elizabeth. But of course, as we all know, there has been very limited success in implementing criminal responsibility. I think there's been a failure in what has been termed by many people gender justice. That's justice that takes into account the gender dimensions of the violence and of the many sites and forms of violence that are directed at victims specifically because of their gender. And again, as has just been said, not just women and girls, but also men and boys and others because of their gender identity. Now, I think we could have a full discussion about the failure of gender justice within the international criminal mechanisms. There's multiple reasons. Some are technical, some are legal, some relate to the very nature of the criminal process itself. But I think another important point that brings us back to the responsibility to protect is that the focus on criminal law means that the violence is understood in terms of that committed by individuals and armed groups, deflecting attention from the overall violence of armed conflict and from the violence, including sexual violence, that is committed directly by the state through its own agents, and that that violence the state is complicit in through its policies that normalize sexual violence, both during and post-conflict and in so-called peacetime. Policies that, for instance, sustain gender and other inequalities. Policies that place profit above human security and the whole economic cycles. Policies that promote militarism and militarization, and the complicity of states that sustains impunity. And I think this brings us back to the responsibility to protect, because the responsibility to protect puts state obligations towards citizens center stage. And so this is why I think that the two agendas, generally seen as completely distinct, the responsibility to protect and women, peace and security, are in fact complementary and should in fact be looked at alongside each other in seeking some solutions. And I'll just very briefly make 4 points arising out of that. First, states' obligations include ensuring domestic legal systems where international crimes, including conflict-affected sexual violence, are criminalized and jurisdiction provided for in line with the principle of complementarity under the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, as well as states' due diligence obligations with respect to the acts of non-state actors under international human rights law. So this also entails ensuring women's equal access to justice, redressing the inadequacies and trials of sexual violence in domestic courts, not only in conflict, but also in peacetime. And as we see so often, the legal system just does not work well for women, including, for example, in the United Kingdom. The Women, Peace and Security resolutions, as well as the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, have provided some various pointers for what might be useful reforms in this area. But secondly, criminal justice is not necessarily always the first priority for survivors in seeking gender justice. Survivors may well be seeking other approaches, including states' obligations to ensure victims' entitlement to appropriate reparation. And appropriate reparation is quite separate from obligations relating to prosecution of offenders. And I think crucially, it does not depend upon survivors' cooperation with law enforcement or security agencies. There is an entitlement to reparation under international humanitarian law. And I think it's also important that reparation is a broad concept. It is not just compensation. It also includes other reparative, restorative measures, memorialization, and so on, as well as a growing concept of a transformative idea of reparation, which includes the importance of non-repetition. And I think that brings me on to the third point, which is the importance of prevention, both of sexual violence and of conflict, which is ultimately at the heart of both the responsibility to protect and women, peace and security. That is prevention both for individual women, so for example, through securing and supporting livelihoods, economic empowerment, etc., but also through addressing the structural, social, economic and political conditions that are conducive and perpetuate violence, inequalities, abusive gender ideology, as has just been discussed, neoliberal economics, militarism. And here I would very strongly reinforce what Elizabeth has just been saying, the need for further research to identify what are these policies and how do they feed into sexual violence. And then fourth and finally, there's the importance of inclusivity, including women's effective participation at all levels in decision-making and policy-making relating to peace processes, peace building, reparation, justice and security mechanisms. This is the first pillar of women, peace and security. It's also core to the responsibility to protect, is preventive as well as reparative. But I think both agendas are too often perceived as being top-down, as being about the international community or the individual state's intervention. The UN Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect has pointed out that the most successful cases of atrocity prevention are when local, national, regional, and global actors work together, acting collectively to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes. So to quote her, addressing sexual violence must be, quote, something that begins at home and extends abroad. And in this, the expertise and knowledge of local women must be drawn upon and supported. And I think the COVID epidemic, in fact, reinforces and is a potent reminder of this. National efforts cannot be effective without local community involvement. Global diplomacy and cooperation are essential for prevention of further transmission. But there can be no assumption that some people or states need to be protected because they are unable to protect themselves, and that there are others who are charged with or have put themselves in charge of doing the protecting. Rather, it should be about joint and inclusive participation with support from the local communities and in accordance with their priorities, and ensuring access to and delivery of all human rights, including economic and social rights, which again is an important measure, in fact, for securing gender justice. And of course, at the end of the day, political will is an absolute priority in achieving both the aims and objectives of both these agendas under international law.
Thank you very much. And finally, before we begin taking questions from the floor, and just to remind our audience, please do submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and please do include your name and your university or other affiliation if you have one. But before we get to those, we will now fortunate to hear from Kate Cronin-Furman.
Thank you. So I was really pleased to receive this invitation to participate in the panel because the topic of CRSV and R2P relates to a set of questions I've recently become preoccupied with about how information about systematic sexual violence gets publicized, how it gets interpreted in the service of understanding broader atrocity and conflict dynamics, and how it gets used to justify policy responses. So there are a couple of reasons this has been on my mind. One is that several times over the last few years, I've found myself involved in public conversations about whether something is or is not a genocide. And patterns of sexual violence are often major features of those conversations. Though sometimes, as we're going to come to in a minute, they actually don't seem to figure in those conversations. So the case law of the International Criminal Tribunals that Christine alluded to a moment ago has established that when committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, acts of sexual violence can constitute the crime of genocide. And that's been really important because it's meant that perpetrators who haven't necessarily been involved in mass slaughter can be convicted of genocide when their commission of sexual assault is part of a broader genocidal campaign. So that's about interpreting specific acts of sexual violence through the lens of the broader conflict dynamics. Rape committed in the context of a genocide can itself be an act of genocide. What I'm interested in is essentially the inverse, how we extrapolate out from the commission of sexual violence to an understanding of that bigger picture. So for example, in looking at the attack perpetrated by the Burmese military against the Rohingya in 2017, many activists and experts, myself included, found the brutality and deliberateness of the sexual assaults against Rohingya women and girls to be plausibly indicative of that genocidal intent. And at the very least, it seemed to give the lie to the Burmese claims that they were simply conducting counterinsurgency. So the commission of sexual violence in that particular case has become absolutely central to the way the global narrative about the attack on the Rohingya has evolved. Now, for me, observing and participating in the development of that narrative has sat really uneasily alongside observing the framing of sexual violence in another context I know well, which is Sri Lanka. So over the years, decades at this point, a steady stream of evidence has flowed out of Sri Lanka, attesting to high rates of custodial sexual assault and sexual torture of Tamil detainees, both men and women, during and after the war against the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam. But somehow this fact has not made it into popular or academic understandings of this conflict, which tends to be categorized as one with a very low incidence of rape. And as Libby noted a few moments ago, that's due to the tigers' particularly strict restraint in this respect. So the erasure of systematic sexual violence from this conflict narrative is quite noteworthy, in part because the particular forms of sexual torture being deployed are exceptionally vicious. I'm not going to describe them here today, but we've seen international rapporteurs and other human rights experts, including statements in their reports to the effect of, in 30 years of working on this issue, these are some of the most disturbing violations I've encountered. And speaking personally as someone who's worked on human rights in a number of conflict-affected settings for a long time, I have to echo this. These are truly horrifying abuses that we're talking about. But the erasure is also noteworthy because many in the Tamil victim survivor community are adamant that they have suffered a genocide at the hands of the Sri Lankan state. That is not a claim that has gotten a lot of traction on the international stage. So successive Sri Lankan regimes have been fairly successful at framing their conduct of the war as counterterrorism, and at alternately denying human rights abuses or portraying any incidental atrocities as the work of, quote, a few bad apples. And when they've faced consolidated international outcry and pressure over violations of international law, the label that's generally been applied is war crimes or occasionally crimes against humanity. So what is happening here? This is widespread use of brutal sexual violence by state forces against a marginalized minority, similar to the case of the Rohingya. Yet unlike in the case of the Rohingya, it's not been treated as something that might raise the possibility of genocidal intent and tell us something informative about the broader conflict dynamics. So, spoiler, I don't have a good answer to this, but what I've outlined here is the motivation for a new project that my co-author Nimi Gauranathan and I are working on. And there's a few things that we think may be happening here. So the big one is that to a large extent, sexual violence is still being treated as a separate issue from the politics of broader patterns of violence. And the fact that violence against women is siloed from conversations about preventing and responding to mass atrocities is probably not a big surprise to anyone here. So WPS scholars and activists have made the point that when we look at early warning models of mass atrocities, we don't find rates of sexual violence or indeed often any gender-specific indicators included in the risk factor. And there's been a lot of pushback against this in recent years, and hopefully this is changing, but we're still seeing this to an extent. And even where sexual violence is recognized as relevant to these conversations, it's in a very constrained manner. So the big move that the international courts have made on CRSV is to say that what happens to women, and let's face it, there's still very little recognition that men can be raped, what happens to women during war can be political. It's not always just opportunistic crime or an inevitable consequence of war, but it can be a political act. But the genocide cases that we have from the international criminal tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia are examples where the politics are basically impossible to ignore, because the prosecutors presented evidence of, for example, perpetrators saying in so many words, "We are raping you to destroy your nation." So while these precedents do get us out of that archaic kind of spoils of war mindset that says that wartime sexual violence is epiphenomenal to the politics of the conflict, it really only takes us so far towards admitting that sexual violence can reflect politics. It doesn't get us to the idea that it might actually be fundamental to understanding them. And it's left us very dependent on analogy to these paradigmatic cases of Rwanda and Bosnia. So this brings me to the last reason that this question of how information about CRSV gets publicized and interpreted has been on my mind. And that's that my current research is on how evidence of atrocities makes it from victim communities all the way to global publics. And I'm particularly interested in grassroots documentation processes and in how, especially when perpetrators are attempting to suppress evidence, members of victim communities or their diaspora co-ethnics become critical brokers of information about atrocities to international audiences. So the connection to what I've just been talking about today is that these information brokers have to make strategic choices. They have to package information to attract global public attention and hopefully intervention of some kind. And that means understanding and playing to international expectations and biases. So when we have these very strong pre-existing frames operating at the international level among advocates, academics, policymakers, about what it is, for instance, that genocidal sexual violence looks like, that drives what evidence activists are going to bring forward, which affects what gets tried and convicted at international courts, as well as the knowledge, both academic and conventional wisdom, that is created about unfolding crises, which in turn creates the precedent for analyzing future situations going forward. So lather, rinse, repeat. And this is how we end up with, to take a recent example, the same handful of Rohingya women in Cox's Bazar being interviewed 50 or 60 times by different international actors, all asking them about the sexual violence that they experienced at the hands of the Burmese army. All of which is to say, I think it's worth thinking critically about what kinds of performances of victimhood were compelling and what the downstream effects are, both in terms of our ability to understand and effectively respond to mass atrocities, and in terms of the very real human costs to victims whose stories are mobilized in the service of demonstrating protection worthiness. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you to all of you for these fascinating and troubling opening remarks. And just another reminder to the audience, if you would like to submit a question, just please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and do indicate if your question is directed to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. Please also do leave your university or other affiliation, should you have one. And now turning to our first question comes from Stuart Maslan at the Centre for Human Rights in the University of Pretoria. And he asks, do the panelists think the UN mechanisms, including the special representative, have made a concrete difference to the protection of women during armed conflict? I'm not sure who would like to take that one first. Perhaps we might stay with Kate for the first response to this question.
Sorry, I lost my connection quickly. Can you repeat it?
Yes, certainly. So do the panelists think the UN mechanisms, including the special representative, have made a concrete difference to the protection of women during armed conflict?
Sure. So I think I'm going to respond quickly and kick it to my co-panelists. For me, I find questions, broad brush questions like this, a little troubling to grapple with. I think, when we look at these mechanisms, we can see that in particular cases, they have enormous effects, right? So, it is not nothing if some small number of victims their lives are materially improved by policy measures. I think, when we come to the question of, is this the best thing we could be doing? It is not my opinion that it is. But I think, yes, we see concrete impacts in the lives of individual victims as a consequence of the greater attention that's been mobilized around this issue, as a consequence of the bureaucracies that have been created to address it, as a consequence of the many dedicated activists and advocates working to improve this problem. But for me, these are very separate questions.
Thank you. And perhaps Elizabeth Wood would like to address this. And I wonder also how far you see these developments as responsive to the social science knowledge that you referred to in your introduction.
Well, I think to take the second question first, certainly if you look at the arc of UN Security Council resolutions, there's been not initially, but kind of midstream, a recognition of sexual violence against men and boys. More recently, an increasing recognition of the possibility, though not a lot of documentation, of sexual violence against gender and sexual minorities. And I think some of that comes from academic research, particularly that's based in the field. And of course, some of it comes from direct engagement with women's organizations, human rights organizations, people doing the hard work constantly on the ground. I agree with Kate that while we may be able to point to particular communities who are have maybe had to some degrees the violence against them alleviated, mitigated, and so on, overall, I do not think that we see a pattern globally of a decline in conflict-related sexual violence. So to the extent that the intent of bringing global attention, global resources, global actors to bear on it, sad to say, I've not seen documentation of that. Christine, I don't know if you agree.
You're muted, Christine. Sorry.
Thank you. No, I agree totally with what Elizabeth just said. And somewhat cynically, I often end up thinking, who are the UN mechanisms created for? Are they created for the international community to think that it's doing something rather than for improving the situation of women, men and boys, girls on the ground? And we see this, I think, very much with Women, Peace and Security agenda. It's been 20 years, 10 resolutions, it's the Security Council, the pinnacle of the UN system, etc. It doesn't work closely enough with the UN human rights bodies. The UN human rights bodies face major obstacles, particularly in terms of resources, time, money, people, etc. They're constantly having setbacks to it. And the UN mechanisms themselves are subject to the political demands of, in particular, the Permanent Five in the Security Council. So we had the situation in last October, the 20th anniversary of Women, Peace and Security, when in fact the latest resolution was not, the draft resolution that was put forward by Russia was not adopted because a number of states, including the United Kingdom, abstained because they felt that it was in fact retrograde, too bland, not progressing what was going to actually lead to improvement on the ground. So I think there's an enormous goodwill. I think the individuals who are the people involved in the UN mechanisms work extraordinarily hard, but face major obstacles and face constantly the political obstacles to their tasks. I agree with Elizabeth. I don't think we've seen a decline in what follows. A very negative response, I'm afraid.
Actually, staying with you, Christine, we've had a question from Shradra Dubey, who is an intern at TMC Asa Institute, who asks, what are your thoughts on the seemingly paternalistic and masculine nature of the principle of responsibility to protect, seen in the context of its use by more powerful states against weaker states?
I presume that what the questioner is focusing to is the particular aspect of the responsibility to protect relating to intervention, particularly military intervention. And there is no doubt at all, yes, about the messianic view by some states that they are the protectors and other people are to be protected by them. And I think that that is a major problem with the responsibility to protect. But if you focus, as I was trying to do in the presentation, on the way in which the doctrine can be used at the local community level, working with people within local communities, particularly women and girls, then those would be ways of trying to move away from that paternalistic and militaristic masculine view of it. I think it's been a problem that in a way there has been too much focus on that. On the idea always was that it was supposed to be a responsibility, not an invitation to intervene. But too often it has become this top-down and in ongoing interventionary type process.
Thank you. Kate, is there anything you would like to add into that question?
Sure. Norms entrench in the presence of power, right? So, it is the case that R2P is a tool that is available for powerful states to pick up and use for their own purposes. And that cuts both ways, right? So, the first example of the use of R2P to justify humanitarian military intervention was the case of Libya. Were civilians genuinely suffering? Yes. Would that intervention ever have happened if it were not the case that Gaddafi was a global pariah? And it was a situation where it was relatively easy to get abstentions on the Security Council, to drum up support from a wider number of states? Yes. So, this is the world we have. This is the context in which norms emerge and develop. I think, we can easily point to the ways in which, human rights institutions, humanitarian norms, et cetera, are used in the service of power. That doesn't mean they aren't also available to be used in the service of other interests, in the service of protection, to be used by other actors. So, yes, this is the case. No, it's not fully damning about, the prospects for R2P to do something useful and good in the world.
Thank you. And staying on a similar theme, and also with you again, Kate, if you don't mind, I'd wonder if you'd like to comment on how current approaches to conflict-related sexual violence, especially those rooted in R2P, equip us for situations such as those seen in Xinjiang, where particularly powerful actors who, of course, hold the veto power are actually arguably perpetrating sexual violence to the point that it might be genocidal or certainly a crime against humanity.
Yeah, so this is just a remarkably hard case for kind of any kind of human rights engagement, human rights pressure, any actions that we might hope would affect change, right? So, as you note, China is phenomenally powerful in the international system, has that veto power on the Security Council. And, we see kind of this iterative effect that we always see, right? Which is that international institutions are created with the hope of doing a little bit of an end run around some of the effects of power and system dynamics. And, they still exist on top of those power and system dynamics. So they are affected by them in many of the same ways. And it doesn't mean we don't push the needle forward a little bit, but it does mean that, we really can't expect R2P to provide us with this magic bullet that's going to help us address a situation of China or the US systematically perpetrating abuses against ethnic minorities. What that means is that there aren't prospects for coercive actions, right? But that doesn't mean there's not room for kind of marginal impact around the edges. So, we have seen in the last few weeks that China does indeed care about its international reputation. It cares how international actors, Western actors, are framing the abuses in Xinjiang, right? So Pompeo, on his way out the door, decided to label the atrocities in Xinjiang as genocide. And we can have a whole other conversation about whether that was a reasonable or positive thing for him to do, but the Chinese response suggests that indeed they are listening, right? And I think the other thing to remember is that human rights actions have audiences other than their kind of direct target, right? So, given anarchy, all the stuff that my students in their international relations classes have drilled into them, it's hard to make a state that is entrenched into a position change its behavior, right? We just don't have the leverage to do that. But that doesn't mean that human rights pressure, human rights institutions don't have impact, because there's all these other audiences, right? And it matters that, all of China's trading partners are hearing this, right? Are hearing that, this is potentially genocide. It matters that other states that might be in a position to treat their ethnic minorities the same way in the future. It matters what response they're seeing, right? So I think, I have unfortunately a fairly pessimistic response about the prospects that international reaction and invocation of R2P or any other kind of human rights instruments is likely to directly convince China to stop what it's doing. But that doesn't mean that I think these actions and these types of engagement are meaningless. Rather, I think they have important indirect effects that matter for the lives of victims in both Xinjiang and elsewhere.
Thank you. And I think it's also kind of poignant to point out, whilst we're discussing responsibility to protect, that it covers 4 crimes, of which genocide is one of equal severity of crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing. So almost to an extent, the debate about whether or not a particular situation is genocide isn't necessarily deserving of the strong international attention which it garners. But moving on to the next question, this is for Elizabeth Wood, and it comes from Alina Grainer at the University of Constance. To what extent do you think academic research suffers from the entrenched gender stereotype which view men as perpetrators and women as victims of sexual violence during civil wars?
I think it suffers much, much less from that in the academy than it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. There is so much research on women's agency during war, women's agency in the aftermath of war, from the denunciation of sexual and other forms of violence, often very bravely in the face of further violence, to their participation in armed organizations themselves in various roles, to indeed their own participation in perpetration of violence against civilians, including in some settings, sexual violence against civilians. Moreover, over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, the increasing attention to non-girls and women as victims of sexual violence has also been an ever-emerging theme. Most recently, the call for further research and documentation of sexual and other violence against gender and sexual minorities in various places. So I think we see in the academy both lots of research on the agency of girls and women in conflict settings and in their aftermath, often against enormous odds, but also a much more fine-grained understanding of the conditions under which different people end up engaging in perpetration of different kinds of violence. So where I think the silo continues to the detriment of all is something that Kate was analyzing with such clarity, which is the kind of siloing of research on sexual violence into a kind of corner, and the reluctance to understand that the insights that come from the research on the dynamics that both drives its occurrence, but also founds norms of restraint against it. It's been very difficult to persuade people working on other forms of political violence to take our insights very seriously. So that's been a frustration, but I don't think it takes the form that I understood from the question. I don't know if the others want to comment on that.
Thank you. And I'll just sticking with you for a moment, Elizabeth, if you don't mind. We've had a question from Oscar Reynolds, who is at secondary school, and it's always wonderful to have participation from the younger generation who we rely on for the future. Do you believe that data and information collection on conflict-related sexual violence is evenly focused between crimes committed by less powerful countries and more powerful ones, such as permanent members of the UN Security Council?
No, I think they're not evenly focused. I think the documentation of crimes of sexual violence is sadly quite informed by different kinds of politics, whether it's kind of the politics of great powers of the kind that we were discussing a bit ago, or the politics on the ground that Kate was describing about what kinds of claims should be advanced given a kind of strategic and tactical engagement with what gets heard by powerful, be they human rights organizations or international agencies. So no, it is uneven. That said, however, I think what is very well documented is that the differences in frequencies across armed actors are so sharp that I don't doubt that the documentation of differences in frequency, form, and targeting are very real, even while we acknowledge the unevenness in reporting. And I want to say, I think it's getting better. I think, for example, we pay a lot more attention now in the academy to the kinds of violence against civilians on the part of the US than used to be the case.
Thank you. And now, Christine, if you don't mind fielding the next one. This comes from Detmer Kramer, who is a policy officer at Protection Approaches, which is a very good NGO here in the UK. It asks, on the issue of Xinjiang, how does the absence of violent conflict impact the use of multilateral tools and agendas like R2P and women, peace and security? I think you're muted again, sorry.
Yeah, I've got children in the house, so I was trying to make sure they don't intrude on it. Sorry, so what was the question? How is the absence of conflict impinge upon measurement? Legally, there is, of course, the framework of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, which has been conflated much more in recent years, but still leads, I think, to a greater unwillingness to intrude or intervene when there is nothing that looks actually like a conflict in that classical sense. Now, R2P is very clear that, in fact, the prevention pillar is precisely before anything that looks like conflict actually emerges. And Kate referred to the importance of early warning and so on, and also the need to take into account gender issues within early warning. So again, I think there is nothing in the doctrine that prevents any intervention despite the absence of any conflict. The degrees of what is legally allowed change, as either a non-international or an international armed conflict is understood. We saw that very much with Syria, for example. But doctrinally, there is no problem. But I think we're back to all the issues that Kate in particular has been talking about with respect to the veto power, the fact that China, of course, is not a party to the Rome Statute of the ICC, to its ability as a great power to stand aside from the various institutions that have been set up.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, if the other panelists won't mind, as we're coming to the end, I might not give you both a chance to join in, and I'll ask you all to comment quite briefly on a final question, if you wouldn't mind, which comes from Christina Stefan at the University of Leeds and co-director of the European Centre for R2P. She asked, what would the panelists identify as some strategic choices for those advocates recognizing the links between these two agendas as significant and needing more attention, and aiming to move away from sexual violence being siloed more often than not from conversations on prevention and R2P? Perhaps, Christine, you want to go first, or would you rather honor?
So what are the strategic areas? I think very much to try to see the two doctrines holistically, multisectorally, and to see how the legal framework can operate in conjunction with, obviously, the research policy aspects, to try to strengthen the overall framework, and therefore no, I think I'm losing this. I don't think that made much sense. That trying to stop seeing them as completely top-down, this is what we must go in and do, but rather to try to see a holistic approach to examining the human rights frameworks within the country, within the context of economics, the delivery of economic, social rights, humanitarian, etc. It's a holistic issue. The silos that other people have talked about are multiple and need to be addressed, broken down.
Perhaps Kate, would you like to address this?
I've a little bit lost track of what the precise wording of the question is. However, I think the answer to almost everything is context matters, regardless of what the topic of the panel is or what the question was. I'm gonna go with context matters for my answer. And I think here particularly, Christine has multiple times kind of made a plea for localization. right? And for the fact that, you know, we need to kind of stop conceptualizing these as one size fits all top-down frameworks that can just be kind of popped onto any individual context, and, you know, think more about the ways in which they are useful and can be responsive to particular, you know, affected community priorities, and can be adapted by activists working in particular contexts. So I think, you know, this is an unsatisfying answer to the question, which is kind of what should the grand strategy be? But I think, you know, kind of thinking about it in terms of, you know, what the nexuses between these frameworks are as it impacts particular conflicts, as it impacts particular affected communities, may be the more fruitful way to approach the question.
Yeah, I don't think I can add to what Christine and Kate said, except to endorse Christine's emphasis on a holistic and multi-sectoral approach. And I just want to echo back, Christine, something that you said early on, that you know, this has to do with neoliberalism. It has to do with the primacy of the value of markets over forms of human community, but also that of Kate, the emphasis on local context. And I would just add that in my work, I have had the enormous pleasure and honor to interact, as I know have the other two panelists, with many different activists, advocates, attorneys, people who are doing the ongoing, really difficult work on the ground in these different contexts. So yes, context matters, and so does the enormous courage of our interlocutors on the ground.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you. It's now time to bring to a close this video panel on conflict-related sexual violence and the responsibility to protect. I'd like to thank all of our audience for wonderful, many thought-provoking questions. Unfortunately, we could only get to a few of them, which is very regretful. And I thank again our panelists, Elizabeth Wood, Christine Chinkin, and Kate Cronin-Furman. And please do check back shortly on the Centre's website at www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk, where the video of this discussion will shortly be available to view. And we also have a new YouTube channel, which the link is available on the website. So in a few days, this will be available there. So thank you all very much for your time once again, and goodbye.